Hi class, Chapter 4, Racism and Racial Inequality. The issue of race has perplexed our society for centuries. There's some people that believe that race has no basis in biology. There are no definitive races in existence today. So why are we even talking about race? Shouldn't we talk more about culture and ethnicity and things like that? Well, sociologically, race is an enigma in a lot of ways. It is a very complex concept. It is also a very modern concept. Ethnicity tends to be a more ancient concept because people all over the world have come in contact with people of the same race, but of different ethnicities, who spoke different languages and who had different cultures. It wasn't until the expansion of empires and travel and technology that traversed continents that we began to see the concept of race emerge in the 17th century. In the 17th century, the concept of race was designed to define an entire human population as slave, as property, and to distinguish them from the rest of society that was predominantly white and dominant in society. So, though we may debate the biological basis for race, we cannot question the social consequences. Race has real consequences for people and society. We can socially define people based upon how they look. We don't look at a person's genotype or DNA. We refer rather to a person's phenotype, those genetic characteristics that are expressed, like skin color, like the color of your eyes, the texture of your hair, the size of the nose and the lips. And it is ironically that we can look at different races of people forensically, like looking at a skeleton, and distinguish those who are white or Asian or black from the cranium, from the skull. So, race has consequences for people, for individuals, for families, for groups, for social institutions, and also on a global scale. The concept of race can be distinguished from ethnicity. Ethnicity has more to do with culture. Now, people who have race also have ethnicity. Races cannot be broken down into significantly meaningful characteristics because people have certain characteristics that look alike. And those characteristics have meanings in our society. When you look at a person who is black, what do you think about? You think about the stereotypes of a person who, you think about basketball, soul food, soul music, or rap, or hip hop, or something like that. Those images come to mind. And it's not racist to do so. It's just the matter of how we perceive different races of people in society. When you think of someone Asian, you think of someone who is highly intelligent, book smart, especially when it comes to science and all the stereotypes of Asians. When we think of Native Americans, we think of people that are stereotypically, they're exotic and they're very close to nature. And all of these things represent not the groups themselves, but the perceptions in society that we have of these groups. Ethnicity and ethnic groups refer to groups that can be broken down into significantly different categories. They're significantly different and significantly meaningful in terms of those differences. For example, whites and blacks typically are considered races because those statuses are very powerful in our society and define who we are in terms of our social position in society. You see blacks as a racial minority, whites as a dominant group and a majority in our society. And it's pretty simple for us to do that. However, we can break down whites into a category of whites versus white ethnics. We have one category called WASP, WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They're typically from Northern Western Europe. They're typically Protestant, Christian. And then we have other whites that are referred to as white ethnics, who are from Eastern Europe and who are within Western Northern Europe, but not within the category of WASP. For example, German Jews, the Irish, who tend to be Catholic, Italians, who tend to be Catholic, are not part of that WASP category. In the development of the United States, the first immigrants to this country were WASP. They were the Germans, they were the Scandinavians, they're the British. They're the ones that dominated the landscape of the East Coast, the colonies, the original colonies. And that happened up until and peaked in the 1880s, if you will, the late 19th century. It wasn't until 1920 that the white ethnics came to this continent. They are the ones who are the Irish, the German Jews, the Polish Jews, the Russian Jews. They were the ones that tended to be the new wave of white immigrants in this society. To this day, in the 21st century, white ethnics have been virtually assimilated into society. One time there was a strong aversion toward people who were not WASP, who were Catholic and who were Jewish, a very strong anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic sentiment. Some of these things still exist, but they do not tend to be the rule within our society today. Then you have the Hispanic population. The Hispanic population is very closely tied to the indigenous Native American population in the Americas, and also having connections with the Spanish, who are European, but not WASP. And so the amalgamation of Spanish and indigenous Native Americans is what created the population of Mexicans, Americans, and Hispanics in all three continents: North America, South America, and Central America. Then we have the Native American population, which is the indigenous population that occupied this continent, the continents of the Americas, for thousands of years. And they are the indigenous population that pre-existed all other immigrant groups to this continent. So we have the various racial groups, we have ethnic groups, and we have the consequences for the definitions and the meanings we attach to race and to ethnicity in society. There are two components of race that you should know about. First of all, that race is a category of individuals who share common phenotypical characteristics, the ones that you can see, and they are considered to be socially significant. So we could sort of break this down into two parts. One is biological, the phenotypical characteristics that you see: skin color, texture of hair, size of the nose, lips, all of these characteristics that go along with the biological features. And then we have the social significance. What does it mean in society to be black, to be Hispanic, to be white, to be Asian? We have all of these various stereotypes and meanings that we attach to race that has consequences for society. There's also a no-race school, I should mention it, that there are people that believe that there's no such thing as a race, there's only the human race. The problem with that is that people in society continue to attach meanings to racial differences. You have people that identify racial differences when it comes to crimes that are committed, how you identify a suspect. When the police come on to a scene and there's a body laying down, they identify the race. In medicine, there's an identification of racial differences because some diseases are more racially specific. For example, sickle cell anemia in blacks, or osteoporosis in whites and Asians. You have many different diseases that are tied to a person's nationality and race. So the idea that there's the no race school sort of dispels the whole idea that race continues to exist. There are some both biological and both social factors that play into the concept of race in society. Perception is real in society. It's not necessarily that race has any inherent quality or value, but because people have perceptions about race. For example, I don't know if you've seen the movie Boys in the Hood. And when you think about black Americans, sometimes those images are very impressionable in our minds. We think of boys in the hood. We think about black gang members and violence and drug dealing and things like that. Much like the environment I grew up in, I did in fact grow up in South Central Los Angeles in the 60s, and I was exposed to all of the things you see in that movie, pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers and all of those things. The problem is that when we generalize to an entire population these images and stereotypes, that's where we create false perceptions of racial groups in society. So these stereotypes tell us more about how we see race rather than what race tells us about the category itself. So race fundamentally is a socially constructed reality. It is something that was created. It had a purpose in history. It had real consequences for people in terms of their status within society. It had economic consequences. It had political consequences, and continues to have consequences for people in society today. So when it comes to race and social problems, we can see race itself as a social problem. Historically, a sociologist by the name of W.B. Du Bois conducted research on what was called the Negro problem, which was the problem of race in society after slavery and as blacks entered into the larger society, and what were the consequences for doing so? What is it that should be done in reference to this large, predominantly black society that was seeking to be more integrated in the institutions of society, into the economy, into the educational system, into the larger society as a whole. So we can see that for society, race can be defined as a problem, and that has consequences for people. On the other hand, we can look at race as any other factor within society. It is something that distinguishes categories of people, like gender, like age, or education, or employment. And we can see how this explains what it means to be a member of a racial group in society. We also have a racial stratification system. Stratification has to do with how people are positioned in society in a hierarchical system. There are some that are at the top who enjoy high incomes, wealth, power, privilege, and then there are those at the bottom who have disadvantage and who tend to be in poverty. When we look at the majority in this society, whites being the majority group, statistical majority, and sometimes that concept is misunderstood. A majority does not always mean statistical. What it means is to have advantages and to have power, to have privilege, to have wealth, to have access to networks in society. That is the concept of the majority or the dominant group. But there's some members of minority groups, and there are exceptions to the rule. Minorities are those who have disadvantage. For example, Hispanics are disadvantaged as a group, particularly when we look at Mexican Americans. However, we have some Hispanics, like Cubans, who do not tend to be disadvantaged. We have Asians who are a statistical minority, but do not have the disadvantages of other minorities like Native Americans, blacks, and Hispanics. So there are some anomalies and exceptions to this rule, but the idea of understanding the majority and minority is very important. It's not statistics that explains the most significant difference between the majority and the minority, but it is disadvantage, that minorities tend to be disadvantaged. Women, by the way, which intersects with race as well, because there are women of color and there are women of various racial ethnic identities, that white women in particular are not a statistical minority. They are as numerous as males. However, white women tend to be disadvantaged when it's compared to their male counterparts. So statistics is not the best way to explain a minority. Historically, during slavery in Virginia, there were 2 blacks to 1 white. Statistically, blacks were in the majority, but not in power. In South Africa, under apartheid, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa, and the reason why, when elections were open to blacks to vote for president, blacks outnumbered whites 4-1. But during apartheid, blacks outnumbered whites 4-1, but blacks were disadvantaged. So the point is that the statistical differences do not explain the difference between majorities, dominant groups, and minorities in society. So the problem of race continues to plague our society, and it is often difficult to address these problems, and primarily because we live in some degree of denial, and race becomes somewhat of an enigma in our society in terms of trying to explain racial differences and the consequences of race in our society. There is what's known as a racialized thinking. There is an ideology of race that exists in our society. There's a historical ideology known as the Old South mentality. In the Old South mentality, this is what's known as traditional racism, where you have the idea that racial minorities are inherently inferior to whites. That means that no level of education, there's nothing that racial minorities can do to overcome their inherent inferiority. That is no longer the dominant view. There still exist pockets and groups of people who hold that particular ideology. But today we have a more modern form of racism. It's not a racism that believes, that espouses the inherent inferiority of minorities, but that minorities are not realistic in terms of their demands for change and for equality. They're asking for too much too soon. So there are other apologetic ways of saying that racial minorities do not deserve equality and to be fully integrated into society, but not adhering to the Old South mentality. There are a number of concepts you should understand. The first one is the concept of prejudice. Prejudice is an attitude. It is a negative attitude toward members of a different group. Well, some people would argue, well, you could also be prejudiced towards your own group, not by definition. By definition, Gordon Allport, in The Nature of Prejudice, defines race, and it is a working definition of race, that race race prejudice in particular has to do with an aversion or a negative attitude towards someone of a different race. To have a prejudice toward one's own race is more accurately referred to as self-hatred. To dislike members of your own race or to dislike your race itself, your own race itself, is referred to as self-hatred. Prejudice is directed toward an out-group member, a person of a different race. And according to Allport, we all have some degree of race prejudice. We all believe that our race is good and other races are less desirable in some way. But we're not all racist. Racism, on the other hand, is an ideology or a belief system that legitimizes discrimination or treating others different. So this is the behavior, where prejudice is an attitude, racism is a belief system that reinforces our attitudes toward members of different races and justifies discriminating against them and treating them differently. So prejudice is an attitude, racism is a belief system, and discrimination is a behavior. The problem in our society is discrimination. And discrimination can be intentional, it can be unintentional, but has the same consequences for minority that deprives them of equal opportunities, deprives women of equal opportunities. It deprives people who have disabilities with equal opportunities. The problem of race in society has continued to be on the back burner of our political agenda, and there have been a number of remedies that sought to address the problem of race. Historically, there have been Supreme Court cases like Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, 1954 and 55. 55 would be the all deliberate speed case, that they were to ensure that schools would be desegregated. And if you have seen images or read historical accounts of how controversial this was, that blacks were forced to go to white schools, and white schools were forced to accept black kids in those schools. And so this Supreme Court was very controversial and had real consequences in society. We've had also Supreme Court cases, Plessy versus Ferguson during slavery. We've had all types of legislation that was passed. We also have had constitutional amendments that were passed, like the 14th Amendment to end slavery, that no involuntary servitude except for punishment for crimes. We've had affirmative action, which was a way to remedy the past discrimination. It happened in the 1960s under the Nixon administration. We've had the Bakke case, the U.S. Supreme Court case, Allen Bakke versus the University of California of Davis, that argued reverse discrimination, that he as a white male was discriminated against in the admissions to the University of California Medical School. And so there have been a number of cases addressing this problem. And if you have any questions about these concepts, do email me and I'll be happy to clarify. As I mentioned before, discrimination is a significant problem in our society. You can have discrimination on an individual level, but you can also have discrimination on an institutional level. Face to face, there are people that deny opportunities to others. But we also have institutional discrimination, where we have those who, that within society itself, we have discrimination as a policy. It could be more explicit or implied, but has the consequence of denying opportunities to minorities within the social institutions of our society. So you can have it on an individual level or on a macro scale, or when it comes to the social institutions of society. Attitudes toward race have changed in recent decades. Arguably, these attitudes have improved, that you no longer hear of the Old South mentality, but today we're more likely to see a more modern version. For example, that minorities are too demanding, or minorities are unrealistic in their expectations for change, the timeline for change, the nature and extent of change. That has the same consequences as the Old South mentality, because what it virtually says is that nothing should be done. So when looking at the issue of race, there are many intersections. There's political consequences, there are economic consequences, there are consequences in terms of employment, education. So when we look at the issue of race, it crosses many of the social institutions of society. One of the most pressing problems today is the problem of immigration. We have the problem of people perceiving that this country should have closed borders on the one end of the scale. A more politically conservative perspective. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have those that believe we should have open borders, that there should be a free-for-all for people to enter the country. But what we do know is that illegal immigration is a very small minority of people in our society, and that we have many factors that contribute to the immigration to this country. One is the pull factors. Pull factors have to do with the economic and political stability in this country, and along with the push factors being the economic and political instability in other countries. As long as the problem of race is political, We will continue to debate whether or not we should talk about race at all, or what should be done, if anything, to address this pressing problem. Sociologists are interested in, first of all, understanding the problem, understanding its consequences for people and society. So if you have any questions about this chapter 4, racism and racial inequality, be sure to email me, dmonk@se.edu.